The river roared louder than usual, swollen from a week of relentless rain. The once tranquil stream had transformed into a raging, foaming surge, carrying debris downstream with merciless force. Anything caught in its grasp would be swallowed whole. Ethan Carter, a 22-year-old college student, had grown up in these woods. He knew every trail, every shortcut. But today, something felt different. His usual morning run along the riverbank was interrupted when he heard a sound that didn't belong, a bark, faint and desperate. Ripping out his earbuds, Ethan's pulse quickened as he scanned the churning waters. Then he saw it. Perched on a moss-covered rock in the middle of the current was a German shepherd. The dog crouched low, ears flattened, tail tucked between its legs, its soaked fur clinging to its trembling body. The rock was barely above water, and with the river rising, it wouldn't hold for long. How did it get there? Had it been swept in? Abandoned? There were no signs of an owner nearby, no calls for a missing pet. He pulled out his phone. No signal. Running back to town would take too long. The dog barked again, locking eyes with him, pleading. Ethan's mind raced. The river was deadly. If he miscalculated, he'd be the one needing rescue. His gaze darted around for anything useful. Then he spotted it. A fallen tree trunk stretched partway over the river. If he could get to it, maybe a sharp crack split the air. The rock beneath the shepherd shifted. For a split second, Ethan saw pure terror in the dog's eyes as it scrambled for grip. And then, the unthinkable. The rock tilted, the dog yelped, and it fell. Ethan's body moved before his mind could catch up. He sprinted toward the river's edge, the world blurring around him. The dog flailed in the current, struggling, sinking. No, no, no! The shepherd kicked desperately, trying to leap toward safety, but the river had it now. Its head bobbed once, twice, before the current pulled it under. Without thinking, Ethan jumped. The impact was brutal. The freezing water slammed into him, yanking him downward. He barely had time to surface before a wave crashed over him, forcing him to choke down a mouthful of icy water. He coughed, gasping, blinking frantically. There. A few feet away, the shepherd thrashed, paddling with every ounce of strength it had left. Ethan swam harder than ever. His arms burned, his legs felt like lead, but he pushed through. A final surge forward. His fingers brushed wet fur. The dog yelped, twisting in fear. Ethan grabbed hold of its scruff, holding tight. "I've got you!" he gasped, struggling to keep them both afloat. But the dog panicked, its legs kicking wildly. They were losing the fight against the current. Jagged rocks loomed ahead. If they hit, it was over. A fallen branch jutted from the water, half submerged. One chance. Gritting his teeth, Ethan kicked toward it. The river fought back, but he forced them forward. 10 feet. 5. Almost there. He reached. His fingers caught the branch. For a terrifying moment, he thought his grip would fail. His muscles screamed, his body numb. But he held firm. He pushed the shepherd up first. "Come on, buddy, climb!" The dog clawed at the wood, slipping, scrambling. Then it made it. The shepherd collapsed onto the branch, heaving, water dripping from its fur. But Ethan wasn't safe yet. His arms trembled, his fingers slipped. And then he fell. The river swallowed him whole. The current yanked him under, dragging him like a rag doll. The cold hit his chest like a hammer, stealing the air from his lungs. He flailed, searching for anything to hold on to, but there was nothing, just dark, crushing water. Then teeth. Something grabbed his shirt. The shepherd. Ethan barely had time to process before the dog yanked him upward. He broke the surface, coughing, gasping. His head pounded, his limbs ached, but he wasn't done yet. The river wasn't letting go. Roots jutted out from the riverbank, his last chance. He reached, fingers stretching, lungs burning. Almost there, a wave slammed him sideways. His head struck something hard. Stars exploded behind his eyes. His grip faltered. No, not now. A growl. The shepherd lunged, sinking its teeth into his sleeve, yanking. Ethan's body moved with it, just enough to reach the roots. His fingers dug in. He hauled himself up, coughing, choking on river water. And finally, he was safe. For a long moment he lay there, panting, staring at the sky. Then, A wet nose nudged his cheek. The shepherd. It hadn't left him. Ethan turned his head, meeting deep brown eyes. The dog wagged its tail as if to say, "You saved me first." A weak laugh escaped Ethan's lips. He reached up, fingers tangling in the shepherd's wet fur. They had both survived. But one question remained. Who did this dog belong to? Ethan sat up slowly, his limbs heavy, every muscle aching. The dog sat beside him, shaking out its drenched coat, spraying water in all directions. "You really pulled me out, huh?" Ethan rasped. The shepherd gave a small wag of its tail but stayed still, ears perked forward. Ethan forced himself to stand. The second he did, the dog stood too, staying close, matching his steps. He let out a small breath. "Guess you're coming with me." The dog wagged its tail again. For the first time since the fall, Ethan felt something other than exhaustion. He felt companionship. The hike back was rough. His body ached. His soaked clothes clung to him, but the shepherd never left his side, occasionally glancing up as if checking on him. "Not gonna lie," Ethan muttered. "I didn't think I'd be making this trip with a dog today." The shepherd huffed, almost as if it understood. After nearly an hour they reached the edge of town. The familiar sight of houses and parked cars felt surreal after the chaos of the river. Ethan sighed in relief until the shepherd stopped. Ethan turned, confused. The dog had frozen, ears stiff, staring straight ahead. Following its gaze, Ethan's stomach dropped. Half hidden beneath some bushes was a torn collar, and next to it, a leash. The fabric was frayed, nearly ripped apart, as if someone had tried to restrain the dog, and it had fought to escape. A cold chill ran down Ethan's spine. "What happened to you?" Ethan murmured, kneeling beside the leash. The dog hesitated, but after a moment it stepped forward, pressing its nose against the torn fabric. Ethan's heart pounded. This wasn't just a lost pet. Something had happened to this dog. But what? His mind raced. Had it run away from someone? Had it been abandoned, or worse, had someone hurt it? Ethan's jaw tightened. He looked down at the shepherd, who was still standing by the leash, tail low but eyes steady. This dog had saved his life, and now Ethan was determined to return the favor, no matter what it took. Ethan stared at the torn leash, his fingers brushing over the frayed edges. The fabric was damp, mud-stained, and looked like it had been here for days. This wasn't an accident. He glanced at the German shepherd, who was still watching the leash with quiet intensity. The dog's tail hung low, its ears twitching at every distant sound. Had someone abandoned this dog, or had it broken free from something or someone far worse? The thought made his stomach tighten. "You didn't just get lost, did you?" Ethan murmured. The shepherd didn't move, but the silence between them spoke volumes. Taking a slow breath, Ethan picked up the leash, folding it carefully before shoving it into his jacket pocket. He wasn't sure why. Maybe instinct, maybe curiosity, maybe something deeper. One thing was clear. This dog had been through something, and Ethan wasn't about to ignore that. Ethan started toward home, his body still aching from the river's brutal grip. The shepherd followed without hesitation, staying close by his side like a silent shadow. As they reached the edge of town, Ethan noticed people watching. A few neighbors stood near their porches, whispering to each other, eyes flicking toward the drenched shepherd at his side. Ethan frowned. Did they recognize the dog? Before he could ask, an older man, Mr. Howard, a retired fisherman who knew everything about everyone in town, stepped forward. "That dog," Mr. Howard said, his voice low but firm. "Where'd you find it?" Ethan hesitated. "By the river. It was trapped on a rock, almost drowned." Mr. Howard's expression darkened. His gaze drifted to the shepherd, who stared back in silence. "That dog's bad news, son," he muttered. "If I were you, I'd stay away." Ethan's jaw tightened. "What are you talking about?" "People say it belonged to someone out in the woods, a man who didn't take too kindly to strangers poking around his property. That dog showed up here once before, looking half dead. And then—" Mr. Howard exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Next thing we know, That man came looking for it, and he wasn't happy. A cold chill ran down Ethan's spine. "Who was he?" he asked. Mr. Howard hesitated, then shook his head again. "Just watch your back, kid." With that, the old man turned and walked away. Ethan stood frozen, his pulse hammering. His gaze drifted down to the shepherd. The dog had saved his life, and now he was supposed to turn his back on it? Hell no. Ethan squared his shoulders and continued walking. He didn't care what rumors surrounded this dog. What mattered was the look in its eyes, a look that wasn't dangerous, but trusting, hopeful. The shepherd had chosen him, and Ethan wasn't going to let it down. But deep inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had owned this dog before might not be done looking for it, and that scared him more than anything. Ethan sat on the floor of his small living room, a towel draped over his shoulders, his damp clothes finally starting to dry. He had wrapped the German shepherd in another towel, rubbing its fur gently to warm it up. The dog didn't resist. If anything, it leaned into his touch, closing its eyes for a moment, as if finally allowing itself to rest. "You must be exhausted, huh?" Ethan murmured. The shepherd lifted its head slightly, then rested its chin on Ethan's knee. The weight of it, solid, trusting, made something tighten in Ethan's chest. How had he gone from a normal morning run to risking his life for a dog that had no home? And more importantly, what was he supposed to do now? Ethan had always loved dogs, but he had never owned one. His apartment was small, and between his college classes and part-time job, he barely had time for himself, let alone a pet. But looking down at the shepherd, seeing the way it had chosen to stay by his side, despite everything, how could he turn it away? As if sensing his thoughts, the dog let out a soft sigh, closing its eyes again. Ethan ran a hand over its fur, noticing the way its ribs showed faintly beneath the damp coat. It was too thin. How long had it been alone? And more importantly, what was it running from? That thought brought back Mr. Howard's warning. "That dog's bad news, son. If I were you, I'd stay away." Ethan frowned. Someone had owned this dog before. Someone who had come looking for it before. Was that person still out there? A sudden chill ran down his spine. Ethan glanced at the torn leash on the table. He hadn't paid much attention before, but now he noticed something else, a faint stain on the fabric. Was that blood? His pulse quickened. Had the dog fought to escape from whoever had it? Was it hurt? Ethan gently lifted one of the shepherd's paws, checking for cuts. The pads were rough, cracked in some places, as if it had been running for a long time. His jaw clenched. Someone had hurt this dog. And if Mr. Howard was right, that person might still be looking for it. A loud thud outside made Ethan's heart jump. The shepherd's head snapped up, ears suddenly stiff, body tense. Ethan held his breath, listening. Another thud. Closer this time. Footsteps. Ethan slowly stood up, his muscles still sore from the river. He moved toward the window, careful not to make a sound. The shepherd followed, its eyes locked on the door, a low growl building in its throat. Ethan swallowed hard. Someone was outside. His fingers tightened into fists. Maybe it was just a neighbor. Maybe someone had seen him bring the dog home and wanted to ask about it. But deep down, he knew better. The shepherd growled again, louder this time. Ethan reached for his phone, his hand slightly shaking. The signal was back. He hovered his thumb over the emergency dial, just in case. Then a knock. Not a polite, hesitant knock. A slow, deliberate one. Ethan's stomach turned. Who the hell was at his door at this hour?